without further ado, it's my great privilege to introduce to you someone that I've really admired for a long, long time, a true pioneer and legend in the glass world, Mr. Mark Peiser. Thank you for being here, Mark.
Thanks, Rob. And can everybody hear this thing? Anyway, good to see you all. Okay, I'll get into this. Earlier this year, I was honored by the Chrysler Museum's purchase of my piece, Passage 7. Hey. It's a recent example of my inquiry into light scattering glasses. And I'd like to thank Carrie and the Chrysler Museum and all its supporters for making that possible. Also, this year, I was awarded the Corning Specialty Glass Residency up at Corning. This allows me to work with selected glass scientists to develop personal projects utilizing their materials and resources over the rest of this year. 3 weeks ago, I gave a talk at Sullivan Park, which is Corning's research facility, to introduce myself and my work to the glass science community there that I'll be working with. And that talk is what I'm going to share with you this evening. It's a survey of the glass work I've done over the last 52 years. And also, since I can't imagine what I've done in glass without my preceding 29 years in other experiences and other lives, I've included a bunch of that personal history as well. To me, in retrospect, it all seems to fit together. So I will start at the beginning. After being born, my folks took me to a phrenologist. For those of you who weren't around in the 1930s or the Middle Ages, phrenologists foretold the life outcomes from the bumps on your skull. I was later told he predicted great things for me. I was very excited by the news. Soon after, they obtained a certificate allowing me to enroll, when old enough, in Chicago's Lane Technical High School. It was always assumed I would have a career in science and engineering. Then, this was my first public recognition of my manual skills. Why was this in the paper? Proud moment. It was because, I'm sure, my mother, a journalism graduate, was a reporter for the Lerner newspapers in Chicago, and my father, an engineering grad, was a photo hobbyist, and he took the picture. He had done civil engineering, laying out roads in Illinois and South Dakota. And in his late 20s, though, for family concerns, he returned to Chicago and put himself and a brother through pharmacy school. And then each opened their own pharmacies. He never said so, but I don't think he was ever really happy after that. I remember my first craft making experience is when I saw the world from maybe 30 inches from the floor. It was a red fire engine printed on heavy paper. I had to cut it out using scissors, which I began doing. In a few inches, I came to a bump sticking out from the outline. There was no one to ask, so I thought a moment and decided it didn't look like a fire truck, so I cut straight through it. Soon I came to another bump, cut through it, and then another. When it was all cut out and folded on the dotted lines, I realized those bumps were the tabs that were supposed to hold it all together. I don't know what my words were then, but I thought, duh. And I felt lost. I think right then is when I learned to never start making something without a plan. I don't need to know what it will look like, but I do need to know how it goes together. I don't start until I do. When I was in the 3rd grade, I got interested in butterflies, read some books, got a net. One day my father brought home a big glass jar filled with cyanide. That's how you kill insect specimens. The neighbors were horrified. Certainly I'd kill myself and maybe them too. For my birthday, my folks took me to the home of the curator of the Field Museum's butterfly collection. He spent hours showing his personal collection. That was really a great gift, and thank you, folks. That's probably what gave me the courage some 40 years later to call Waldemar Weil one of the great glass theorists of the 20th century and ask, may I come talk to you about opal glasses? In time, I got to not like killing little creatures in my poison jar. I became happy as an observer rather than a collector. A few years later, my father brought home a wooden box filled with chemicals. There were no instructions. Within a few weeks, I knew what combinations of things would burn or explode. Trial and error, quite like I approached glass chemistry. Our house was half a block west of Sheridan Road, and after that, there were 2 blocks of undeveloped land before Lake Michigan. That land was a wilderness and a favorite place to be. One day, in an open area, I met a man flying a model glider. It was made of 6 pieces of balsa wood and very clean, perfectly joined, elegantly proportioned. It was the most exquisite object I think I'd ever seen, and its flight was amazing. His name was Ralph Rapine, and he took me under his wing, so to speak, and I became an aero modeler. He lived on the 3rd floor of a building across the street. He was a freelance graphic designer and a watercolorist, as well as a model builder, which he took very seriously. He taught me rudimentary aerodynamics. We spent afternoons making tests of paper and balsa wood, which we'd launch from his 3rd-story window, where the best would float over the alley, across the gas station, and into Sheridan Road traffic. Once I was building a plane at home. It was almost done except for the tail rudder, and I was concerned it might not look as good as it might. So I went to Ralph's and asked him to design it for me. He said no, that I could do it as well as anybody. Well, perhaps I did, but that was a super gift. Thank you, Ralph. You know, when I did visit Waldemar Weil, showed him the work I'd done and the glasses I'd made, his answer was, I should write a book. Didn't help. The last time I saw Ralph was at a Chicago art fair. Hadn't seen him in 20 years. He had watercolors, I had glass. We were talking by his work when 2 women came up and asked him for lessons. Ralph answered, fine, meet me at Belmont Harbor next Saturday morning at 5:30. They said, 5:30? We can't do that. Ralph replied, you have to sacrifice for art. As they were leaving, they were still muttering, we can't do that. I don't think anyone purposely does art to make themselves miserable. It's just sometimes an unintended consequence. My father had a workshop in the basement, and I grew up using it. I was always making things. In 6th grade, he gave me this jigsaw. The neighbors were aghast. Surely I would cut off my fingers. I'm still using it, and other of his tools, including this bandsaw that cut halfway through his thumb. Dad, that was a lesson I'll never forget. Thanks. It turned out I didn't go to Lane Tech, but Evanston Township High School with its progressive education program. Still, my favorite subject was mechanical drawing. And I continued making things, got into turning wooden bowls, got into audio and making speaker systems and souping up my '54 Ford. In 1955, without much thought, I went to Purdue in electrical engineering. It seemed I was the only one who could finish the lab projects, but I was becoming conflicted with the theory. After 2 years, I gave up on it, thanking Professor Gray for his earnest but unsatisfying answers to my questions. With more serious consideration, I transferred to the Institute of Design at IIT, which was the American home of the Bauhaus School from Germany. Not long into fall classes, I had a misunderstanding with the disciplinary committee that postponed my studies for a year. I went back to work for Chicago Rawhide Manufacturing Company, where the previous summer I'd had a job as a draftsman designing oil seals. It was pretty formulaic, changing dimensions to customer specs. But it was 1957, the year Sputnik launched the space race. Some here may remember at its beginning, one after another of America's rockets exploded 5 to 10 seconds after ignition. Chicago Rawhide was told it was the liquid oxygen seals that were failing. Find a solution. We built a small building and equipment to test designs and materials. By then I was doing more than drafting, and I got to design the stainless and quartz test chamber containing a shaft driven by a 20 horsepower motor geared up to 80,000 RPM at extreme pressures and temperatures. I also laid out the control console with its multitude of lights, switches, and gauges. One of the novel materials we investigated was graphite, my first encounter with what in 1983 would become the linchpin of my Inner Space series. I never knew their final solution because by then I'd made peace with the disciplinary committee and returned to classes. But in a year or so, our rockets were not exploding. At the Institute of Design, it was an interesting time. A number of the instructors had come from Germany, and many of the students, like myself, were older and had been around some. Seemed everyone had strong opinions, and there was much discussion about things like, could design be art? Could graphics be art? Could you commercially produce art? Could anything of quality be made of plastic? And some students were already asserting that they were artists. The school's director was Jay Doblin, a thoughtful, well-known presence in the field. Mies van der Rohe ran the architecture department, and we heard a lot about less is more, form follows function, truth to materials, and simplicity. We were also taught to think of processes forensically. Critiques were done by models made by the students. But Mr. Fuller, who I thought was a big windbag, got a lot of attention then. And Jay gave a lecture about geodesics and other smart structural ideas like tension compression systems. Next day, on the way to school, I invented a new one. I explained it to Jay. He said, "This is important. You should patent it." I set the wheels in motion. He said, "You should write about how you discovered it." I said, "I'm driving down the outer drive and I just saw it. What's more to say?" I think Jay was often exasperated with me. I owe him much more than I thought at the time. Thank you, Jay. And about that patent. Turned out someone in Montreal applied for the same thing a week earlier. I've applied and researched others with similar results. It's led me to believe ideas are in the air. Anyone could snatch them when the time is right. And about writing of its inspiration. Sometimes I think I grew up in Lake Wobegon. Overstating the obvious makes me angry. Exaggerated claims are deceptions. Mystification is obfuscation. And you know, sometimes that sort of thing turns up in artist statements too. The graduation ceremony was scheduled a few blocks from Orchestra Hall, where Emil Gilels, one of the greatest pianists of anyone's lifetime, was giving his first Chicago recital. I went there instead. After getting my degree in product design, I worked in several design offices. I worked on a Seeburg jukebox, which was fun, and an electric carving knife, which I thought symbolized everything wrong with our society. I went in the Army, got married, got a design job at a point-of-purchase display company. Good job. After some time, I was in charge of their model shop of 6 or 7 guys making prototype and presentation models, mostly sheet metal bins and plastic beer signs. Meanwhile, from an early age, intermittently, I had taken piano and started in high school, and starting in high school, developed a deep longing to be more involved with the language that spoke to me most directly. And I began taking night classes in piano and composition. Back at work, I supervised and made some of the intricate presentations myself. After a while, my models got a bit of a reputation for closing the deal. But I'd also developed a spastic colon, so I quit corporate life to go to music school. I was 27. I figured I'd fulfilled my obligations to society and promptly had my first anxiety attack. Of the many stupid things I'd done in life, and there were many, this seemed to top the list. And to support it, I set up a tool shop in my garage and opened a freelance model making service. I enrolled full-time at the DePaul University School of Music. I studied piano with Viola Haas, who traced her pedagogical, I think that's the word, lineage back to Franz Liszt. One of the many things she told me was, you don't have to have perfect pitch for a concert career, but it turns out that those with concert careers do, and I didn't. Meanwhile, the model business was doing great. I made all sorts of things from all sorts of materials, and I was accommodating. I get calls like, we don't have drawings, but we need something sort of like, and we need it tomorrow morning. I'd have it there at 9 o'clock. I did a lot of all-nighters, sometimes 2 or 3 in a row. One night, working before dawn, I had an idea. What if I could make a living making things I wanted to make, not the toasters and beer signs that I'd built my heart and soul into? I remember that moment, and I realized that then I couldn't imagine what that life would feel like. I hadn't seen Jay in years, so when I heard he was lecturing at the Art Institute, I went. A student asked, I want to be an artist. What graduate school should I go to? Jay answered, you don't learn art in school. Sign on a tramp steamer for Singapore. Back at conservatory, I was learning perfect pitch wasn't my real problem. Instead, I had to acknowledge that what I hoped to be required gifts I just did not have and could not acquire. And in 1967, I surrendered what had long been the dream of my life. Of all man's endeavors, music seemed the most worthy and the one that most deeply touched my heart. It left a void in me, like losing love. I needed to change my life and to get away and to think about it. So, through a series of coincidences, I happened to take a glass-blowing class at Bendlin School. On day 1, I was told that the studio glass movement had just begun. On day 2, I heard that Bill Brown, the director of the school, had started a resident program, and he looked at it as an experiment to see if anyone could make a living doing studio craft. On day 3, we met. And I applied, though I hadn't yet made a single piece of glass. And he said, okay. I didn't see anything like art in my future. I didn't have a particular interest in glass or a dream. I just wanted to learn a trade and live in the woods. Back then, it was called dropping out. The next thing I knew, it was fall, and I was all alone in this glass studio until the next summer. I'd had 5 weeks of classes during which I'd seen one demo that seemed competent. I asked my teachers for more information, and they told me there wasn't any. The Venetian death squads had seen to that. And moreover, technical information was all proprietary, so don't even bother asking. There were 6 people then on Bendlin Mountain, and no one knew anything about glass, and I didn't know anyone who did. I stood there and thought, wow, this is going to be my life? Okay. Then I thought, oh, this is way dumber than going to music school. And I began teaching myself about glass. In 1967, the craft world knew almost nothing about this new material. My approach in that ignorance, continuing to this day, became to imagine a piece that gave voice to some place in my soul and then figure out how to make it. I felt it appropriate to devise pieces that needed to or could only or best be made of glass. In the beginning, I was drawn to blowing by the directness of the process, but with time, I was drawn into considerations of imagery related to vessel forms, and then the implications of transparency upon the world of objects, and my mind's eye began to perceive the volumes of things differently. With more time, I began to see glass as not transparent, but as atmosphere and light, and started to compose works for that. But not just any glass would do. I formulated my share of glasses and devised processes to satisfy my visions. Typically, I've worked in series, and they have evolved like a game of leapfrog between my dreams and technical awarenesses, and my pieces relate a balance at a given time. Their subjects are meant to portray my thoughts, feelings, and experiences, as well as the nature of glass, and may seem capricious and disconnected, though I understand them like life as a progression. And, like life, there are not many claims about my intentions that do not have exceptions difficult to explain. In the end, perhaps the only thing I can say that's been constant throughout, remained true, is that it all comes from an inclination to share beauty. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My initial responses to glass were mixed. Blowing seemed to come easily. However, that part of me that was aware of standards for performance, music, for example, was aghast at the lack of discipline and vocabulary in the young glass movement. That part of me from engineering was astounded at the lack of technical information. The aesthetic part of me saw practically nothing of consequence being done, personal opinion. It was the perfect chance to reinvent the wheel. I liked that. When Harvey Littleton's enthusiasm began the movement, Nick Labino told him to use Johns Mansville 475 fiberglass as the material. I didn't need to know much about blowing to feel it wasn't a good choice. In 1968, I built a test furnace and began learning glass chemistry. I figured it was part of the job description, as well as building all the equipment and figuring out pricing and where you get materials and blah, 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 blah. After 1970, all my work has been done only with my own formulations, which includes the opals and colors. In 1975, a set of skills, techniques, and materials came together with my admiration of the North Carolina landscape to start my Paperweight Vase series. It began by pursuing the ability to construct detailed imagery within vessel walls and ended in considerations of that imagery related to vessel forms. The impetus was the opaque landscapes I'd begun in 1970. Around 1974, I experimented with using a torch to apply bits and lines from canes within the blowing process. And the detail it brought promoted the development of the pictorial foreground. By then, I could make reasonably good crystal, so it replaced the opaque background. That meant in vessels, rather than a circular canvas, the creation of an enclosed, visible environment, and the manipulation of that interior space became, for me, the most compelling and consistent focus of the work. Convincing images that were seamless around 360 degrees and could be seen from inside and out and could be executed were not easy to come up with. I began to look in the real world for spaces like puns of vessel forms. Shower stalls and drive-in movies were some I never got to make. There were pieces done as sketches, focus studies to work out techniques in coordination with Dale Brownscombe, who helped on most of the series. By 1981, nearly all the pieces were based on autobiographical material. The last piece of the series was a view into and out of my childhood attic bedroom. Building an image from bits of cane was tedious work and usually done on 3 layers of glass for each piece. The most involved piece took nearly 18 hours of continuous work on the blowpipe, though 7 to 10 was more common. My eyes, elbows, and back were complaining, but most importantly, my conceptions were making demands that just could not be executed, at least on a professional level. So, in 1981, I took a year off to develop a new set of parameters relating process, materials, and object that might satisfy the feelings and subjects with which I wanted to be involved. I had ideas of monolithic castings made of colored transparent glasses like compositions of light. During that year, I juggled the possibilities of various approaches and the objects they encouraged. In 1982, I introduced my Inner Space series. It was predicated on pouring glass directly from the crucible in which it was melted into molds that allowed composing the internal composition of the casting, which would later be cut to the finished form. The molds were of graphite, and the glass was a dense barium zinc. Once started down this path, numerous possibilities presented themselves. But before long, as with my blown work, I began to relate it to the landscape, and more particularly to the sky. That seemed to be a good subject for my understanding of the tint and flow of glass. Making a sculpture of the sky is rather a challenge. Like, have you ever seen one before? But I was heartened by the words of the famed English painter John Constable, who said, in landscape art, the sky was, quote, the keynote, the standard of scale, and the chief organ of sentiment. When I was in the Army, lifetimes before my involvement with glass, I dreamt of working with form as I imagined a sculptor would. I was captivated by the notion of almost featureless forms portraying feeling and intent. So in 1994, I changed the nature of my work again. Virtually every conceptual aspect was affected, as well as the processes, materials, and feeling. There were a multitude of reasons, but that it took the direction it did was founded on my long-held desire to use form more freely than the techniques my previous work would allow. This work concerns human nature. Its forms and images are derived from two different sensibilities. Some pieces represent forms I sense containing myself in particular states of consciousness. I perceive these shapes from the inside, internally, within my being. Other pieces are an attempt to reconcile my perception of internal states of others as I perceive them from the outside. All of the pieces are intended as portraits, not portraits of individuals, but portraits of consciousness itself. In 1999, I developed a form for contrition. Being a believer that the medium is a good part of the message, I concluded that it should be made of a quite transparent white opal, pure and luminous. To accomplish this, I built a 220-pound bottom pour furnace from which to hot cast a spontaneous striking phosphate opal. After some years, I got to know how to use it by doing a limited edition and repeatedly casting the same mold over and over and adjusting the glass to my taste. However, for one-off castings, controlling the phase separation, that's the density of the strike, was, as Weil wrote, a crapshoot. More later, but first, an enjoyable diversion. Beginning in 2004, I started looking at more creative uses for the bottom pour furnace. Throughout my career, I've worked alone or with one assistant. For the last 20 years, that's been Jake Chamberlain, and on occasions, Jack Brewer, who had worked with me intermittently then for over 35 years. Then, in 2005, Susie Silbert showed up, and I figured we had enough hands to begin what we called the Coldstream castings, which was the only time I've worked with a team, and it was the most fun ever. The inspiration for the series was the Dance of Molten Glass, in which I'd been a partner throughout my career. Then, after nearly 40 years, I'd come to asking glass itself to take the lead. And the arabesques of this series questioned the line between maker and material. After 4 years, Susie left to become who she is today. If some of you don't know, she's currently the curator of contemporary glass at the Corning Museum. And I also had a new direction in mind, which also led to where I am today. In 1970, I was a founder of the Glass Art Society. Last year, their 47th annual conference was held in Murano. There were nearly 2,000 in attendance from all over the world. In 1976, the conference was at Corning, and it would be my first trip there. I'd been in glass for 9 years, and was making a living from my little studio, getting good reviews and feeling pretty good about myself. Then I entered Corning's Glass Center and saw the failed 20-ton first casting for the 200-inch mirror for the Hale telescope at the Palomar Observatory. I was stunned. I felt shrouded in ignorance. I just stood there gaping at the enormity of it. As a kid, I had followed the creation of the observatory, but I somehow had missed the story of the failed first casting of the 18-foot diameter mirror. I looked at it and puzzled the irregular patterns of the missing cores, thinking there must be a reason, a logic, some mystery of the cosmos encoded in their positions. And then there was the color, more like the spirit of light, like the whole thing was made of morning mist emerging from the dark. Like this giant object whose sole purpose was to collect and reflect more light than anything before, had instead captured and held that light within itself. The experience embedded in me another dimension of what glass could be. And in that vision, embodying so much labor and thought, as well as hopes dashed and delayed, that compelled my series 74 years later. My plan for the Palomar pieces was to select sculptural elements from the honeycomb geometry and present them in different contexts, referencing aspects of its creation, science, rivets, instruments, and so forth. There's a long list if I ever had the time. The glass parts are all scaled from the original working drawings. Our first casting, after months of preparation, was, fittingly, a disaster in only 6 seconds, when the resin-bonded molds outgassed black inclusions. And that was just the first of the problems. From the time we began the first mold, it was 23 months before we got a casting that met my expectations. This is what it became. It's titled Seer and alludes to the photographic component of astronomy. It was the 10th mold and 10th cast of this form. I'm stubborn and will repeat a project until I get it right, though right often seems a moving target. The series was the sole focus of the studio for 6 years, and we finished 13 pieces. Here are some of the others. In choosing the failed first casting as a subject, I had another motive. It seemed to legitimize investigating the visible range of translucent opals. Perhaps it's because I live in the haze of the Blue Ridge and the variety of mists and fogs and morning dews that are part of my landscape that compels my attempts to represent them in glass. I have long wanted to portray glass as atmosphere, not transparency. I've wanted to give character to the volume within transparency, to perceive its size. Dead white opals are rather easy to produce. Left on their own, that's what those formulations want to do. But to stop short of that opacity requires more than chemistry. It requires controlling the cooling in specific ways that change from one situation to the next. But then we made this. This is Bridge, a reference to the telescope's place in history and function in understanding, as well as this physical form. It also turned out to be a bridge in my own work, as its coloration confirmed it was the result of light scattering, What that means is that we had created particles in the glass of a size and number to interact with light as the molecules of air and dust in the sky. And like the sunset, when light travels a further distance through the atmosphere, its color deepens towards red. The colors you see are not from pigments, but from the refraction of light itself. When we began the Palomar series, my hope was to create the rather magical blue pseudo-fluorescence of a very light strike. But I really didn't know what the possibilities were. But this was something different. It implied that the perceived color would be dependent on the thickness of the glass. In the past, for smaller pieces, the density of the strike could be controlled with the phosphate content. That seemed to lose relevance with more massive castings and the longer cooling times required, which we were charting. Then we began manipulating the cooling curves. After 18 Palomar castings, what I did know was that no two were alike. But I did know that making the Palomar molds was challenging, and there's a limit to how much care one can continue to expend on hope. That was in 2012, when there were 2 molds for Palomar pieces made and ready to cast. But I had no confidence the glass would meet my expectations, and those molds represented dreams I didn't want to lose. I needed more tests, but something simpler. We were aware the colors we were perceiving were the result of Rayleigh scattering, and that the glass thickness determined form. So what's a test for a glass that deals with light like the sky? Well, why not a sky? Short digression. If anyone ever wishes to research beginner's luck, they really should talk to me. I have a remarkable history of initial successes of such allure and promise as to suck me into months and years of subsequent efforts, resulting only in disappointment. This is one reason I've avoided repetition in my work. I never thought this test would even make it out of the annealer in one piece, much less the colors to align as well as they did. And I did not expect it to begin a new series, Passages, which it did. Why passages? Some of the Palomar pieces and more of my drawings took the form of arches. I felt through them perhaps an opening to a future the mirror would help create. I sensed in their forms an element of transition. Google passages, and you will find a myriad of definitions, places, and implications. I'm aware of most of these, and certainly they inform my efforts. Perhaps I'm especially mindful of the books of that title by Gail Sheehy, subtitled Predictable Crises of Adult Life. Been thinking about that lately. But for this work, I choose a simple definition as a portal from here to there. Perhaps more a noun than a verb, but one that sheds light upon the journey. So with enthusiasm, we cast passage number 2, just as we did passage number 1. And it's not the same. Whoops, where's passage number 2? Dep. Well, whatever. Let me tell you, it's not as good as passage number 1. Okay. And we needed more tests. And this time, how about 120 rather than 180-pound pieces? So began a sub-series called Etudes Tableau, study pictures, named after a group of piano works by Rachmaninoff. Mine were studies of this polychroic glass and how to achieve it. Are we, what are we doing? Well, what, Porto. We got Rachmaninoff? All right, good for Rachmaninoff. Mine were studies of this polychroic glass and how to achieve it. I'd been aware for years we needed to control the temperature inside the mold, inside the oven it was in. Simple idea. Pretty simple solution, but it took years to see a way to do it. But once we did, things got better, more predictable, and I thought of other natural optical phenomena like rainbows. And interpretations of things like this piece, titled Passage 7. Since I can't remember the numbers of any of the pieces, I'll tell you, in the studio we call it flare. And that's as in solar flare, which some of you may be aware of, the enormous eruptions of mass and energy on the sun, whose arching forms are distorted by huge gravitational forces. This piece is unique for my series so far, in that a slight amount of neodymium, a dichroic colorant, has been added to the glass. The result is that its spectrum is overlaid onto that of the light scattered by the glass itself. Making sculpture, where form determines the color, is something to think about, if it's not to be whimsy. It also makes me realize this work is really about light. The last two pieces we cast was the first time we did the same thing, and the glass did the same thing too. So, with a certain sigh of relief, it seemed a good time to quit. In 1971, I was asked to speak at the annual conference of the National Council on Education for the Ceramic Arts, which at the time included the emerging glass arts. They wanted me to speak to what's it like to be a self-supporting craftsman. That they chose that topic and that they chose me 3.5 years after first touching a blowpipe indicates how few were then on that path. What I told them was, it was a way of life that held the opportunity to maintain personal integrity and honesty and to follow your bliss. I've tried to live up to that opportunity, and I've been fortunate in doing so. And yes, over the year, glass did creep into my being and touched and shaped my dreams and gave focus to my life. So, glass, thank you. I just wish you were a little less of a bitch. That concludes my remarks. So, works. Okay. Okay. Oh, thanks. Absolutely, sure, yeah. Yeah, if anyone has questions,
Anyone have a
comments.
question out there? I'm sure someone has a question out there. Colin's got a question.
Thanks for being here and sharing that with us, Mark.
Right.
And it's so interesting to me your technical exacting background and then translating that into the beautiful visual art. Have you had trouble during your career shifting from the really concrete technical standards to then translating into a vision, or has it always flowed? Has it been easier as you've been more experienced with it?
I think it's kind of grown together. I mean, whatever my background, technical or whatever, people have accused me of being a perfectionist, which I don't really accept. I claim to just have standards, but I also, going back to the 60s, again, I think I kind of did the dropout thing because of a certain dissatisfaction with, I don't know, well, the advertising world that I was exposed to, and things, just that sort of thing I didn't want to be involved with. And once I started actually selling work, it really was an issue. Well, what's it worth? I was really the first guy, at least east of the Bay Area, to make a living selling studio glass. And it was really I mean, I didn't know how to prepare for that. How much is it worth? What is, anything like that. And once, well, some years into it with the Paperweight Vase series, I should say, because they did take into, each piece took a lot of, it basically, if you averaged it out, it took a week to make one. I mean, we'd work constantly, but we'd make 50 pieces a year that were good. And, and when we made the first of those and realized, gee, this thing took like 10 hours or something, it was, what do you charge for that when you're selling, things for $50? And, but you can make it in 20 minutes or it's, I don't know. So anyway, in reality, they started to sell for a great deal of money. And I, well, it really got well, I was going to heave, actually, when I realized, holy crap, I sold a piece for $10,000. I mean, this is way back when. And it was just, I had, didn't know how to deal with that either, which was another reason that kind of contributed to changing to the next series, because initially, I, from day one, I'd make pieces, and some of them I felt were better than others. I think we all have experienced that, and I thought, well, okay, this one's worth $5, that one's worth 10. And I priced, and once they got into a bigger range, I was still doing that. The average price of that Paperweight Vase series was not really, anything like the numbers that people associate with them. Because every once in a while, I made one that I said, damn, that's really a good piece. It satisfied me. Now it didn't, and I'd say, well, that's worth X, but the rest of them weren't quite. Anyway, people who were purchasing these things did not understand that thinking at all. And so when I moved on to the next, the Inner Space series, I figured, okay, one price, if it's so big, sort of, it's that. But it, but the my experience is, whatever, still, some pieces strike me better than others. And still, I know I've learned over time that that doesn't mean that everybody who sees the pieces understand it the same way. I mean, I've had the kind of, I don't know what that is, perhaps grow into understanding that. But I do have standards, you know. I mean, I've made some pieces that I thought were really great, except what's that rock doing there, you know? And that either puts it back in the cullet pile, or it, you know, or it, well, I can't do it. I might sign it as a second if the rock's hidden behind something else or something. But I don't know. I got kind of off the track there. Sorry.
Jen?
Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. As someone who's been pushing the boundary of glass as a medium for longer than I've been alive, what are the frontiers in glass that you see now that you're really excited about? The new technologies, the digital media, all the fancy things happening at MIT. What really gets you excited for where glass is going as a medium?
I don't know. I really don't know of anything. Let me kind of I don't know of anything that really is exciting me. I have this wonderful opportunity with Corning this year, and and I've been up there. That part of that residency is. I've told them, you know, of several different projects that I think it'd be cool that I can't really pursue, and you know, with my knowledge and studio, you know, and they look in the file and come up, how about this and that and that, you know, and some of those things look pretty appealing, but I don't see them, at least from my point of view, as you know, going to really change, you know, start anything new, at least from my point of view. Though there are some pretty exciting glasses, you know, well, that they have or that are available at this point that I think people haven't looked into. One of the things that, what is that stuff? I don't know, there are some technical, Jesus, I can't even think of what it's called right now. But there are some things that nobody's, you know, I've tried to push on people, but nobody's bit yet to develop. I mean, the technologies are there, and I think would be, especially for people who are interested in detail or jewelry and, you know, small items, it's a no-brainer. It'd be beautiful. But, you know, I don't know. I haven't seen them. I'm not aware of what you might be referencing at MIT. Oh, that thing. Well,
3D printed glass.
Well, you know,
It's kind of like Coldstream casting.
yeah, it is. It is exactly like that. Only they had to make a computer to do it. And it's actually well, I did say, and it is true. I mean, you know, it had kind of run its course when Susie had to go back to, left. You know, it just, you know, the only future I saw, you know, for us, would be to, computerize it somehow, and I just didn't want to go there. I couldn't see how we were going to get. Well, I saw some things that could happen, but I don't think, and I haven't heard anything from those guys for, you know, after a couple, I guess it was more like 2 years ago when they, you know, kind of came up with that. And
The MIT Glass Lab created
Yeah.
a 3D printer. Mhm.
yeah,
There's a couple more questions.
yeah, sure.
Thank you. And I was hoping you could share maybe one or two of the challenges that you gave the engineers at Corning, some of the outcomes that you're hoping to see, or
Well, one of
things-
the things some people might appreciate, I don't think it's, of course, I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement about anything I saw there. But, you know, what I was hoping to, you know, that we could pursue was one was dealing with glasses with different indexes of refraction. And I figured you get two compatible glasses with different indexes, and you frit them. And then you fuse them back together in various proportions or sizes of frits, hoping to make some kind of obfuscated material that might really be pretty interesting. And conceivably, depending on how big a chunks you're dealing with, you know, it might have some possibilities. Another thing that seems like, well, that they showed me is, I mean, I went around and looked at, you know, a lot of different things in various laboratories. And I'm sitting on a windowsill in one of these, I looked, there was a cast. It was obviously a test of something about so big, maybe an inch and a quarter thick. And I looked at it and said, you know, I could sign that thing and call it a passage piece. And I mean, it was an opal glass of some sort. I still don't know what kind of glass it really was. But it just kind of faded away to where through the center of it, there was just this clear opening, you know, and I thought I could work with that, you know, could do something there. I mean, what else? There was some other, but anyway, those are two of the things. I didn't really see. I saw a lot of spectacular things that they've got, you know, on the shelf, so to speak, but none of them really, you know, fired up anything in me yet. Anyway.
So we have another question here.
I just have a question on the naming of your pieces,
Yeah.
particularly the portraits of consciousness,
Yeah.
because the titles of the pieces so inform the works, the receiving.
Yeah.
Once you read the name, it's like, oh, it's arms, or it.
Yeah.
And so, do you come up with the image or the emotion, or what's your process for linking that? And just to clarify, is the Passage 7, did you say in the studio y'all called it a flare?
Yeah.
Did I? Okay,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. that's-
Okay.
I mean, they're all.
I just want to make sure I understood. But that process of
Yeah.
the language connecting to the piece, I think, is very informative. And how do you do that?
Okay. Maybe I can explain it. It's difficult to explain. Let me put it. I was driving down the road one day, and I had a tape from I don't know, some new age tape from I forget who, you know. And the title of the tape was it was a lecture, and it was Spaciousness. And I was listening to, you know, it was some Zen or somebody. And I actually was quite into Zen some time ago. And I was really realized at the time, and he's talking about spaciousness and openness and all. And I knew what he was talking about, and I suddenly realized, gee, I used to have, that's where my head used to be, and it isn't there now. And I thought, what's different, you know? And I realized that I really perceived, you know, within my consciousness of, you know, inside here, a form. And that's where it came from. And then I thought of other states of consciousness, and certain forms just came up. And I kind of developed a kind of thinking about that I thought was, well, for me, it was really kind of important. but there, it's been a while, but I'm trying to think of what the. But anyway, that's what it was. I basically try to identify that they all come from a feeling, and then trying to identify identify it, and then kind of trying to sense its shape.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Eric here.
Thank you very much for a great lecture. Very, very informative for me. Learned a lot. And I had a question looking and wondering what role drawing has played in your development of your ideas, or as an artist. If you are still drawing, or if are you putting your ideas on paper, working them out on paper, and how does that happen?
I do. Well, certainly earlier on, they all were. I mean, like all the image vessels, they took a lot of planning. Actually, I'd draw. I'd create an image sort of, and then I'd draw a floor plan of where do the trees go on what layer of glass and stuff like that, and also to just familiarize myself with the sense of how do the trees look and so forth. But as the later pieces, as they've become more geometric and such, or depend on that, it's much easier for me just to make models. And yeah, for years, pretty much all of the more recent pieces, I work with models, and we make them rather quickly out of styrofoam or something, and work out proportion. Yeah.
Mark, you mentioned the 47th gas conference that was in Murano.
Yeah.
The 46th gas conference was right here in Norfolk,
Yeah. Yes.
which I'm sure you remember as you were here.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell us maybe just a little bit about like the first gas conference.
Oh Lord. Well, let's see. The guy from Paoli Clay Company which was a company in Wisconsin, who kind of supplied clay and tools, and ultimately marketed these fiberglass marbles and everything. A fellow named Dave Jacobs ran it. Everybody knew him. And he brought a wheel of cheese and a barrel of beer, and for which he was, I think, given an honorary membership or something. But there were Fritz Dreisbach and I kind of organized the first one at Bendlin, and with Bill Brown's kind of grudging permission, and Bill Bernstein also kind of helped there. He was in the area. And we drew up, Fritz and I, we drew up a list of everybody we knew in the States who was a glass person, And on that list, I think there were 35 or 40 people. That was it, And there was a certain limit, I forget what it was, because the school actually, people stayed at the school and ate and stuff. There weren't many people. But what transpired was really, I think, very important, because what I remember mostly were a few bits of technical information that people had gathered somehow on their own, or however, what knowledge they'd acquired. And we just sat around in the dining room at Bendlin School and say, hey, you can make an opal glass if you just add a whole bunch of antimony to it. That was a breakthrough. There were, it was just, looking back, people were knew nothing. But that was kind of it. I think it was just a 2 or 3 day affair. There was just, and of course, people were blowing glass. Um, it, it After being in this game for quite a while, I'm aware that well, I've thought frequently that I feel very privileged. The group of guys, that I knew and and are still working, well, many of them, in the glass scene. We're really a great bunch of people that have to be in contact with throughout your life. There always has been a pretty, well, my total experience is everybody has shared and helped, and there's not been a big sense of competitiveness. It's just been a wonderful thing, and it's hard to explain. From everything has become so well informed these days. I mean, none of us that who were working back then have any of the skills that these guys have today. Because we didn't know. And we all learned trial and error, basically. And and we can get by doing some things, but it's not like we know this is the way to do a thing.
Well, I would like to personally thank you for starting that organization and the community that swirls around it. And I know a lot of people here feel the same.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Well, well, yeah.
And I want to thank you for being here, for traveling up here and sharing your incredible story with us and your brilliance and your work. And of course, we're so thrilled to have not only Passage 7, but some of your earlier works in our collection for everyone to enjoy. And just thank you so much, Mark. And thanks to all of you for being here this evening and for supporting the Chrysler. And if you haven't seen Passage 7 in person, go check it out. It's amazing. It changes throughout the course of the day by the light that's coming through and hitting it. If anyone has any more questions, I think we can hang around for a few minutes. You can talk to Mark directly and grab another drink. I see a pile of cheese over there. So thanks again, and everyone have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.